David, in trying to understand free will, a lot of people use this experiment, the Libet experiments, in terms of trying to show there is no free will. What is it, and what are the different ways of interpreting it?
So Benjamin Libet asked people to lift a finger at the time of their own choosing. So they sat there, they waited until they felt the urge to lift their finger, and they lifted it. So it seems it's the most basic question about free will. Mm-hmm. He had them watching a very rapidly spinning clock in front of them, and he said, report the time that you felt the urge. So then he knows exactly the time that they said they felt the urge, and he knows the time that they actually lifted. Additionally, he's measuring with electroencephalography, EEG, on their head.
The electrical activity, what's going on?
Exactly right. And so here's what he found. He found that people lift their finger at some time, and they typically report that their urge was about a quarter of a second before that. They say, well, right at this time on the clock, that's when I felt the urge. Okay. The surprising part was he found there was brain activity that sometimes a second and a half before the urge started to rise. So you have rising brain activity. Then they said, hey, right now is when I suddenly had the idea to move. And the suggestion was, wow, your brain's known for a second and a half that it's going to move, and you just now got the message, meaning your conscious mind was the last guy to get the information. Okay, so that was Libet's experiment. Now, not surprisingly, a lot of people interpreted that to mean, well, it must mean we don't have free will because your brain has already decided. Now, Libet himself fretted about that interpretation and said, well, maybe we still have veto power. Maybe you still retain the power to say, no, I'm not going to move. Okay. Detractors of the experiment ask, is this really a good example of free will? It's an act that has no consequence. Lifting your finger just doesn't matter for anything in your future or your past. And so some people have criticized the experiment on those grounds and say that in order to really measure how people decide important things in life, you would need something else.
Well, why is that the case? I mean, if you're deciding to move a finger, that's a pretty important, that's a conscious movement. I would think that's pretty valid.
That's right. Well, I'll tell you why. Okay, so I only wanted to mention that point of view, but I'll expand that into my own concerns about the experiment and the experiments that I'm running right now. It turns out that I've been running experiments on people using fMRI and asking them...
Which is functional...
Which is neuroimaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And their task is simply to press one button or the other at a time of their choosing, whenever they want to. And what has become clear to me is that the whole free will question is not as simple as we thought, because when people are doing this, they have a lot of things going on in their mind, one of which is, I want to prove to the experimenter that I'm quite random and that I'm not doing the same thing every time, which means that each button press they do actually has a long history. It's not an independent act. And one of the ways we know that is that you would expect that because people have a choice of hitting right or left whenever they want to, you would expect a random distribution. But it's not random at all. People switch almost all the time because of this impression they have that that's what you're supposed to do to look random. Things like that happen, and that got me thinking about the original Libet experiments. You can't understand these trials in isolation. What we're discovering is that each trial we measure tells us a lot about the history of what has happened and also what's going to happen. And the last complication I'll mention about this is when we ask people, okay, well, what did you feel like when you're doing the experiment? They always report, well, when you really push them on it, they report, well, I wanted to press the button now, but then I thought, no, maybe I won't press it now. And then I wanted to see if I could override my urge to do it and so on. And what's clear is we have multiple voices in our heads. At least some of those voices are trying to impress the experimenter about how random they are. And what that means is that this very simple experiment of lifting your finger or pressing a button box is not as simple as we once thought.
So what are the implications of that?
Unfortunately, the implications are that we're going to need more sophisticated experiments about free will. And I think that the basic interpretation that's flown this whole time about Libet's experiment is maybe too simplistic. And we need to understand what that rising activity is, because it might not be the decision to move. It might be a battle going on between one part that wants to move and another part that's fighting it, and so on, and all kinds of things about what you did on the last trial. And that's what we're actually seeing, which would paint a very different picture.